We're going to take a look at types of loans and types of mortgages. So the first is the type of loan, and this is the rate that a borrower is going to qualify for. Their credit score, their income, their debt to credit ratio, other factors, those are going to determine whether they're going to be considered prime or subprime borrowers. Now, you don't get to make the decision on this. This is going to be decided by the banks. It's their money. They get to decide what you are. So what you want to do is you want to qualify for a prime rate. Borrowers who receive the prime rate have a solid credit score and they're going to present little risk to that financial institution. There's very low risk that you are going to default on your mortgage if you're a prime, if you qualify for a prime rate. The other is the subprime rate. Subprime borrowers have to pay more for their loan in the form of a higher interest rate because their history or income dictate that they are at a higher risk for not paying back their loans. So simply put, they're at a higher risk for defaulting on loan. Therefore, they're going to pay a higher interest rate throughout the life of that loan. Now, we also have types of mortgages. The borrower is going to be responsible for choosing this. You have the fixed rate, which is the traditional 15 or 30-year fixed rate. Simply, you go in, you qualify for a loan, and you decide, do you want to pay that loan back over 15 years or do you want to pay it back over 30 years? The fixed part of this means that the interest rate is not going to go up or down over the life of that loan. Whatever rate that you have in year 0 is going to be the rate when you pay it off in year 30. Okay, so that's not going to change whatsoever. Then you have the adjustable rate mortgage. The ARM is more of a gamble because the rate's going to reset after a period of time, usually something around 5 years. And because of this, your monthly payments could go up or they could go down after that 5 years is up. So what's going to happen is that interest rate is going to reset to whatever the interest rates are 5 years from now or 10 years from now or however long the ARM is for. It's especially dangerous when combined with interest-only loans. So an interest-only loan means that instead of paying for the principal in that first 5 years, you're only going to pay the interest on that loan in those first 5 years or however long that adjustable rate mortgage is for. This was especially But in discussions of the mortgage meltdown, there may in fact have been too much emphasis on subprime loans. Although the driving force behind abandoning traditional lending standards was the federal government's political goal of increasing home ownership, particularly among preferred minority groups, lending innovations like 100% loans, mortgages with no down payments, became institutionalized features of the industry, particularly when the Fed had made banks flush with reserves to lend. The push for relaxed lending standards for low and middle income borrowers was so pervasive and systematic, persisting a full decade, that it is no surprise that it should have spilled over into the standards for higher income borrowers as well. Once this sloppy thinking had taken hold, writes Leibowitz, it is naive to believe that this decade-long attack on traditional underwriting standards would not also lead to more relaxed standards for higher income borrowers as well. When everyone cheers for relaxed underwriting standards, the relaxation is not likely to be kept in narrow confines. Not only were these easier mortgage terms available to speculators, but the surge in demand for housing caused by the much easier access to financing also led to increases in home prices that had the unintended effect of enticing speculators into the market in the first place. A much more significant factor in raising home prices was the artificially low interest rates brought about by the Fed, as we'll see. It turns out that large increases in foreclosures occurred at the same time in both subprime and prime loans. Thus, the subprime loan problem did not, as the headline sometimes suggested, somehow infect the primary loan market. In fact, from 2006 through 2007, the increase in foreclosures was much higher in the case of prime loans than in subprime loans. There were still more foreclosures in the subprime market in terms of absolute numbers, but that's always been the case, and that is why subprime loans carry higher interest rates. Foreclosures primarily came about not because of subprime mortgages, but because of adjustable rate mortgages, the ones Alan Greenspan had once urged people to use, whether prime or subprime. Adjustable rate mortgages begin with what is called a teaser rate, a low interest rate that makes these mortgages initially attractive. After a set number of years, the rate adjusts according to various economic indices. Sometimes the buyer will find himself with a higher interest rate and sometimes with a lower one. The adjustable rate mortgage can perform a useful function in a climate of volatile interest rates when neither borrower nor lender quite knows what the future will hold. Volatile just means that it could go way up, it could go way down, and nobody has any clue what's going to happen. Lenders are more likely to extend loans in such turbulent times if some of the risk can be shared with the borrower. This type of loan was especially appealing to home flippers because their whole point is to get into a house, fix it up in 6 months, maybe even less than that, and then resell the house. So with an arm of 5 years, they would never even get to the point where it was going to reset to a different interest rate. It turns out that there was a larger percentage increase in adjustable rate prime mortgages than there was in subprime mortgages, where all the trouble was said to be. This too explodes the myth that the mortgage crisis came about because of unscrupulous lenders preying on vulnerable people who, for whatever reason, couldn't understand the mortgage terms they were agreeing to. If that were the case, how did prime adjustable rate borrowers get more bamboozled than subprime borrowers? The explanation for the rise in foreclosures that makes sense of the available data involves people who bought houses on a speculative basis, betting that their prices would continue to increase. Now, the speculators could have been buying a house that they would sit on for a month or two and then try to resell at a higher price, or they could have gone in to flip it, to renovate it, to make it look better, and then to try and sell it for a much higher price. This category includes people who flipped houses, meaning they made various improvements to houses and then sought to resell them at a high profit. It also includes people who expected to make a profit by buying a house, waiting a short period of time, and reselling for a profit based on the house's appreciation. In recent years, speculative home buying has been estimated at about 1/4 of all home purchases. Both kinds of speculators would be attracted to the adjustable rate mortgage since they intended to unload their houses well before the teaser rate expires. You could also see that if this was 1/4 of all home purchases, that this would have a pretty significant effect on housing prices throughout the United States. When housing prices started falling just a little bit, only 1.4% in 6 months starting in late 2006, foreclosures skyrocketed. You have to ask yourself, why would they skyrocket if the houses had only lost a little more than 1% of their value over a 6-month period? Already at a record high, foreclosure starts shot dramatically upward, increasing by 43% over that span. The answer has to be because of people looking to try to unload houses that they didn't want. Now, if you were living in a house and it dropped by a percentage point, no big deal. You're probably going to continue staying there, and you're not going to be scared of it, and you're not going to have that impulse to sell. But what if you had no intention of staying in that home? What if that home only belonged to you so that you could resell it later on? And you saw any potential profits starting to melt away because of this decline in home prices. Then you might be willing to go ahead and just get it out of your portfolio through a foreclosure. It is likely that this sudden and seemingly disproportionate rise in foreclosures primarily involved homeowners who had used flexible, no money down mortgages to purchase homes planning to resell them at a profit. With housing prices no longer on the rise and the prospect of profit dwindling, many of these borrowers simply have walked away. Not having made any down payment made walking away all the easier. This goes back to what we've discussed for the last chapter and a half. If you have no money in the game, if you didn't put any down payment on that house, it's really, really, really easy to walk away from it because you're not going to be hurt by it. The bank has taken on all of the risk because they didn't force you to put 20% down. Now, if you had put 20% down, you're going to think twice before you walk away from that house. This sudden collapse points to another culprit: the private agencies whose job it was to rate the creditworthiness of these mortgages. Why did the ratings agencies do such a poor job in assessing the risk factor in these mortgages? It could be argued that at a time when housing prices were consistently rising thanks to the Fed's cheap credit policy, these mortgages were performing well, and the ratings agencies therefore made the superficial decision to rate them highly. Another suggested explanation is that the agencies knew which way the wind was blowing, with every federal agency having even the slightest connection to housing, pushing various homeownership initiatives that involved lower lending standards. According to economist Art Carden, SEC regulations hung over the ratings agencies like the sword of Damocles, and the raters didn't want to attract undue regulatory attention by opposing a politically popular initiative. Okay, so let's break this down. The sword of Damocles. That is a story from Greek mythology in which the servant looks at this king's life and says, "You have it great. It's good to be the king." And the king says, "You should try it for a day." And so the king says, "Come on over here, lay on my bed, get served fruit, have somebody waving a palm branch in your face all day long, but I'm going to hang this sword above your head, and it's only going to be hanging there by a thread." And what that was supposed to represent is that the king's life is always at risk, because there might be somebody internally who wants to get rid of him. There might be external threats from other nations. There's all sorts of risks that come with being the king. So yes, while it looks like it's a great life from the outside, when you're actually the king, you're sweating it most of the time because you know that there are people that might be out to get you. So how does this relate to what we're talking about here? If you're a ratings agency, then you are underneath regulations created by both the Congress and by the executive agencies like the SEC, the Federal Housing Authority, all sorts of places. So what happens if you start rating things that they like, and say these mortgage-backed securities, things that the regulatory agencies and Congress like because it gets more people into homes and therefore makes the government look better and gets them reelected? Well, what happens if you start rating those things no longer AAA, but say that there's a lot of risk involved in them and drop them to a triple B, or maybe even drop them to a triple C? Then what you're inviting is for these ratings agencies or these congressmen to start calling you before Congress, or to start asking questions, to start wanting to see your books. Maybe the IRS gets involved and audits your company. You don't want to deal with all that. So maybe you just go along with it instead and continue rating these mortgage-backed securities high, even though you might have some inkling that there's going to be trouble ahead. That's one way of looking at it. The handful of approved ratings agencies, moreover, are actually an SEC-created cartel protected from competition by regulatory barriers. So not only could the SEC come in and start sniffing around in your books and asking questions about your company, but they also control the barriers to entry in your industry. So if they want to bring in more competition, they have the ability to do so. Given that government-approved rating agencies were protected from free competition, writes Leibowitz, it might be objected that these agencies would not want to create political waves by rocking the mortgage boat, endangering a potential loss of their protected profits. The cartel of ratings agencies deserves all the blame it has received. At the same time, as we'll see, the Federal Reserve's interventions into the economy distort economic indicators and make it harder for everyone, ratings agencies included, to perceive the true state of the economy.